So I'll just say hello, welcome to MeCCSA Radio Studies Network Q&A session. I think this is the fourth one that we've done, but this is the first one where we've had multiple academics who've written a paper together. So you have to bear with us how we work this out, but I'm sure it's going to go swimmingly. And today we are talking about a paper called A Curriculum for Blackness, Podcasts as Discursive Cultural Guides, 2010 to 2020. Which was written by Kim Fox, David O. Dowling, and Carl Miller, who are all here today. So normally what I would do is just say a little bit about the academic we're talking to, but as there's three of you, could I just ask you to just give a very brief introduction about who you are and what your research interests are? So I'll start with, I'll just go through in the list that you're listed on the paper. So I'll ask Kim to go first.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. Of course, it feels a little odd since sometimes I work with you all, but I'm really excited to share our insights on this article. I'm Kim Fox. I teach at the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and I teach audio production, multimedia writing, and other journalism and mass comm courses. And my research interests are in podcasting, and I'm getting more and more into, Black podcasters. And since I'm in Egypt, of course, the Egyptian population and their interest in podcasting. So that's all I have for now.
Thanks, Kim. And next is David.
Hey, I'm David Dowling, and I'm at the University of Iowa, where I teach and do research on the impact of technology in journalism, media, and society. Digital journalism studies is generally the field that I'm in. I've done a lot of work on the digitization of narrative journalism specifically. So this is an extension of this podcast research extends from my 2019 book called Immersive Long-Form Storytelling, Audience, Media Technology and Audience. And there's one chapter in that book on podcasting. And so from that chapter, Kyle and I did a project, published it, and then we had the great good fortune of meeting up with Kim and doing this project, and now we're off to a third one. So das Gesellschaft geht glänzend, as they say auf Deutsch. Everything is booming, business is booming, right, in the podcast world, in terms of the industry and in terms of the sort of windfall of great projects that we have been fortunate to land upon. And thank you for your interest today in talking about this project with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, David. And well, thanks to all three of you for agreeing to come along and be a part of this process. And Kyle.
Well, and I want to second what Kim and David have said is thank you for inviting us, and we're really looking forward to the discussion here today. I'm Kyle Miller. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Dakota, Department of Media and Journalism, and my research interests are kind of combined with David and Kim. I look at the digital effects of media, particularly broadcasting, community media, and then a little bit of sports broadcasting as well. And podcasting is a large part of that too, and just how it's starting to revolutionize and transform the radio and media production in the industry.
Thanks, Kyle. Well, at this point, I was thinking I might read out the abstract, but I hear that Kim has a presentation that might actually serve better than that. So I'll hand over to you, Kim.
Well, actually, you can read the abstract, and it'll be a great lead into what I have here.
All right, I'll read out the abstract then, just to remind everyone. I'm sure everyone's au fait with it, but it's quite a nice framing thing for the video as well. So, African-American podcasting's ascent marks a potent articulation of Black identity and experience in media history, one reaching an unprecedented range of audiences, dialogues, and online communities. This study examines how content, production practices, and digital audiences for Black podcasting generate a metaphorical curriculum for Blackness, a set of discursive cultural guides for listeners. Case studies representative of major genres and publishing sectors where Black podcasting flourished from 2010 to 2020 include humorous commentary on popular entertainment in The Read, independent media's exploration of Black life in The Nod, and legacy media's in-depth cultural criticism and analysis in Still Processing. That's the abstract. Over to you, Kim, for a presentation.
All right, I'll make this quick. And I need to have access, if you all don't mind, please, to share the screen. And while we wait for that access, I'll just say we've been working on this for a couple of years. It went through the submission for a conference and won top debut paper at the Broadcast Education Association. And then we knew that we should go ahead and submit it. So we worked on getting it submitted to, getting it submitted to a journal. So I'm going to make this quick, like an Ignite presentation. And starting off, just going through the abstract very quickly. Just kind of building on some of what Jerry was saying, this looking at the critical interpretation. Of course, we selected these Black podcasts as case studies to look at a few different things. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. We used a couple of approaches in terms of theories, including Garreau's theory of media public pedagogy. I'm really intrigued by that theory, and I'm hoping to use it on some research as well. And of course, there's also Fernbach's symbolic interactionist approach as a part of this research project. And of course, we're going to dig into the curriculum for Blackness part of it and how Black podcasters have, just by default and somewhat organically created the discursive cultural guides. Of course, you all are familiar with our podcast sample from the nod, the read, and still processing. And I'm really anxious to follow up on this. 2 of the 3 podcasts remain in production. The nod is no longer in production and has been in the news in recent weeks. So I'm anxious to also probably lead in that direction. So I'm sure you know from reading the paper a little bit about the nod. They started off as a podcast called For Colored Nerds, and then they were sort of acquired by Gimlet, and then they came up with the nod, which went on for some time before it stopped last year. The read continues to go on, they just continue to produce a lot of content. Their podcasts are really long, like maybe more than an hour, not maybe, always more than an hour. But they're so fun and funny, and a lot of people obviously relate to them. And still processing is the one that really sort of confuses me in terms of their production schedule. It has become very erratic and inconsistent. But recently, they have been repackaging old episodes, giving us the impression that maybe they're going to give us something fresh in the weeks to come. We could hope. I'm not going to really get into the literature review, but several references are there to some content, some research from Ferrani, including this reference from 2017 about the digital spaces that are created, the digital enclaves. Also, in terms of discourse in Black radio, this we definitely found a connection, and I'm sure this is something that will probably come up in our discussion today. Of course, this inclusive digital space is quite interesting because sometimes when the Black podcasters are having conversations, these are not discussions that you'll find anywhere else. But in addition to the inclusive digital space, sometimes it can be not as inclusive, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. In terms of the cultural guides that we alluded to, we looked at a couple of topics. And of course, from the article, you know that that's Beyonce and Black Panther to sort of analyze our production aesthetics. And one of the catalysts for the idea for the cultural guides did come from several years ago when Ferguson happened. There were a lot of academics who were putting together Black Lives Matter syllabi, and we thought that this could sort of fall into that realm. And just a few more slides as we look at the results, that this community building is certainly there. That was one of the focuses of the results, but we also looked at the results in terms of social media, specifically with something like still processing that didn't really use social media a lot, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Finally, we just wanted to expound upon the fact that these podcasters have certainly contributed to an intellectual discourse. And I believe that's probably going to come up in the discussion as well. this may be the last slide, that, what we're getting with these Black podcasters, you're getting so many levels and dynamics, and including some of the points we've mentioned here: humor, pop culture, and of course, very strong narratives with all of the podcasters. And lastly, when we talked about that digital space and the enclaves, Florini talked about this in terms of, it really prevents some trolling. And I thought that kind of cocooning was very interesting, that Black podcasters seem to take advantage of. And lastly, we talked about the intimacy of radio, of course, that lack of trolls that comes up here, and just the depth of the Black experience that comes through with the Black podcasters that we profiled. Always got to do the image credits, and that is it. How did I do on time?
That's great. Thanks, Kim. That's very helpful. Just to say, if anyone has a question, you can either use the Zoom kind of hand raising thing or post it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye and I'll come to you. I have some questions that were already raised when we discussed the paper previously. And then when I ask a question, I know there's 3 of you now, so I'm sure we'll work it out who answers what between you. A good place to start is a question that came up. David, you were saying a bit about this earlier, but how did the 3 of you come to work together to write on this article? Well, you can either raise your hands or just go for it.
Okay, I'll jump in on that. So yeah, I think where this came from was, if we're going to go way back, Kyle was actually wrote a dissertation on college radio at the University of Iowa, where he was a graduate student, and I was on his committee. And so during that entire dissertation that he wrote, we were, the committee and Kyle and us were in intense conversations about podcasting and how radio needs to pivot toward podcasting, and the two need to be working together more closely. And then in the process, I started to realize that my own research in immersive long-form journalism and digital long-form really did just have some serious overlap then with what Kyle was up to. And I pitched the idea of maybe doing a poster at BEA with Kyle. And then from there, we landed the poster. I started to get to know more about all things BEA. And actually, I think it was at that poster that we presented, I said to you, Kyle, have you seen The Nod, right? And this is unbelievable. And there is something happening here, and no one has said anything about it in academic circles. And it's just only scratching the surface then of this whole world of Black podcasting. And so thus, I think at that point, Kyle, you reached out to Kim, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that we had talked about was genres that weren't being covered a lot in scholarship. The first project that David and I worked on was a true crime narrative piece, because we looked at the popularity of serial, we looked at the popularity of podcasting within public radio, and how there is a genre that wasn't being covered a lot in research. And from that, we went into discussions about The Nod and Black podcasting, and saying, look, these are popular types of productions that we're not finding a lot of scholarship on. And David and I had reached out to Kim. I knew Kim had done a lot of prolific work in podcasting, as well as out in BEA. And we said, we would love your expertise on this. And that is how our project really came to be. It was really kind of fun to see the journey from discussions literally right outside my dissertation acceptance meeting, and talking about, okay, we just talked about this for an hour and a half. Now where do we go? To 2 fantastic projects, and now a 3rd really cool project on the role of podcasting, especially in broadcast media.
Brilliant, thank you. One question that came up in the discussions, and I wanted to ask as well, is could you talk a bit more about the 3 podcasts that you chose as case studies? What was the process for that, and the reasoning behind picking those particular 3?
I'll start it off, but I definitely need Kyle or David to jump in. Well, as David mentioned, we knew we wanted the nod to be a part of it. We wanted to go down that route because what they were doing does have a bit of a unique spin on it in terms of how they tell the stories that they tell and just their chemistry between the host. And I think eventually we decided to, I don't know if we ruled anyone out, I think we did, but we tried to find some similarities that were out there, like podcast duels who were doing a similar thing. But help me out, I can't remember who we weeded out.
Not too sure about that either. I can tell you from the still processing standpoint, what stuck out to me was, looking at the foray of a legacy medium like the New York Times in the United States and how they're branching out from not just, print products or online or their normal Times production, but going into this deep realm of cultural type of discussions and podcasting, which is based in the national paper of record here in the US.
Yeah, and so then juxtaposed against that legacy media, outgrowth, which is of course still processing, we had the more grassroots kind of original, I want to say maybe even first wave of Black podcasting production, right? That comes out of, not exactly all the way back to This Week in Blackness, et cetera, that we eventually go back to show those origins. But to be sure, it's part of a much earlier strain of the genre, and we liked that kind of balance, I think, between the two. That that showed, of course, we have a wide kind of array of sectors in the industry that are now invested in this, from legacy media and as Kyle says, the paper of record in the United States, which is the New York Times, and then going all the way back to something which was much more independent media produced. I want to say the Read was. So you have something, and then it merges closer into something more like the middle ground between the two. Then is the Nod with Gimlet. And Gimlet, really, I want to describe that company, that podcast producer, as something that was originally definitely on the side of indie media, but recently was acquired by Spotify. Okay. And Spotify is, as you know, probably is just rapidly taking over podcasting as we know it. It just surpassed Apple in terms of numbers of shows that it's hosting on its platform, et cetera, right now. So platform wars are going on between the two, between Apple and Spotify. But to suffice it to say, I think Kyle says it, and Kim as well, that we were looking for kind of a balance between legacy on the one hand and grassroots on the other, and then something maybe in between.
Thank you. And just following on from what you said there, which, with the way that podcasting is really rapidly changing at the moment, what is it like researching something that is, evolving so quickly? As researchers, as when you start the draft of the, when you're first writing the first drafts, by the end of the publishing process, there might be a completely different kind of situation going on. What's it like as researchers?
I'll start us off if you all don't mind. I agree that academics move a little, and publishing moves slower than podcasting, so it's it's a bit of a crash. But thankfully, in the revision process, we are able to keep the article up to date by adding some of that more current information. So I thought that what we were doing, and still when we look at the research, there's still not a lot out there in terms of Black podcasters. So we were kind of confident that we were filling a void for sure.
Right.
And I'll add to that what Kim said is in the R&R process before publication, we were able to add a lot of things from later 2019 and 2020, to make sure that to keep it as current as possible. And I will say this, podcasting is one of those that I never thought it would be my primary research in terms of my research interests. but it really has, because it's so fresh, it's so new, it changes all the time, and there's so many different genres and ways to bring it into, some of our other research interests, like in sports and news and broadcasting, that we always have new and unique and creative ways to really think about it. The project that we're working on right now about news podcasting is directly related to breaking news events during the summer of 2020, and to be able to look at that from an analysis and research role, as well as kind of the broadcast news convention journalism role, is really refreshing to bring that into an academic construct.
And why did you choose the two, the major kind of methodologies that you use, like Giroux's theory of media as public pedagogy and symbolic interactionism? Why did you choose those two methodologies to use to work on the data, if you like?
I was going to let David go. Go ahead, David. You can start us off with that.
Sure. I think the public discourse one, it made perfect sense to us, because in a lot of ways, this metaphorical curriculum for Blackness, this is carefully chosen metaphor on our part, really came from Kim's idea, because of the idea that there is something like cultural learning happening here and bridge building that's going on. And these podcasts are not just sort of internal, they're really open and for anybody to come in. These are spaces for anyone within and from outside of the Black community to come in and to understand what you need to know about the cultural codes within the Black community and how to read those codes, and what are the essential pieces then of popular culture and how those are read certain ways. So truly, Giroux, I think was an easy pick then in terms of all of our options, and I think the Fernback then just simply goes right to those pieces of popular culture and says, okay, here's a way of decoding it, right? Here's a way of saying that these entertainment products aren't just for your edification, right? But in fact, they're saying things about how the Black community thinks about itself and of itself, and communicates itself also outward to non-Black communities, which is why we picked this one episode from Still Processing to go into detail on, which was on Blaxplaining, and specifically films of from the African American tradition and Blaxploitation films of the 1970s. So their episode covering that, I think, got into that sort of that meta moment where it's a self-reflection, but it's also a reflection outward. That reach outward, I think, methodologically could be addressed here with these two selections. We had a lot to choose from, though. We batted around a lot of ideas. There's some on the cutting room floor probably, but to be sure, these synthesized what we were doing the best. It gave us the most freedom, I think, to really dive in and explain on the case study level what was going on.
Thanks. Just because this is an early career researcher kind of group, I just wondered if you, all three of you, would like to talk about the process of collaborating on a paper. How does that work? Were there any frictions? Are there any pros and cons that you'd like to discuss?
I definitely want to start on this one. I really enjoyed working with Kyle and David. I mean, you really can't ask for a better team, because I remember we were doing the lit review and David's like, oh, I'll get us started. And we set a deadline, and David had it done in like a week before the deadline. And we were like, this never happens. And we all jumped right in and offered feedback. And it's been so seamless for us. And I'm just really appreciative to have, people who respect the process and who do their part. But in terms of the actual tangible part, we mostly use a shared Google Doc to try to organize the paper. We drop articles in a separate folder, that kind of thing. We'll tag someone if, like, hey, can you give us clarity on this? And then someone will eventually move it over to a Word doc where we'll do the final edits and push it off.
Yeah, and I think just adding to I 110% what Kim said, just that, we have shared interest, but then also working well as a team, and just understanding, uh, David is phenomenal on lit reviews and the background and historical culture. Kim and I are, from the broadcast perspective of, okay, what does this mean for like, tangible stuff in the radio industry that we could bring moving in forward. And it's just been an awesome project to work on and collaborate. We're working on our third project right now, and I think third of many more. Just because we bring such good insights to our research and our interests, and it's been really cool working with them overall of bringing in different ways of thinking about podcasting and the audio industry.
And even with the slight time difference, we were able to work through a lot. Occasionally, we might all be in the document at once. And we had a couple of Zoom calls, but mostly we were able to work it out through emails in terms of questions and clarity and stuff.
Getting better at math skills under, adding 7 or 8 to our time zone here in the US. But I would see, notifications from Kim like at 1 or 2 in the morning, because that's when she could work on it. And then I could work on it, throughout the noontime, early afternoon. And then we could kind of, day by day piece things together to really have a cohesive final product.
No frictions at all?
Well, you know what? I think in response to that, Jerry, we definitely all grew, to much more coming out, right, of that process at the very end, and to be sure, frictions, I don't know if you would call them frictions, but definitely moments where we had to reassess what we were doing, right? Each as individuals, maybe at certain junctures. But, that all totally healthy and moving toward fruition and enriching and invigorating what we were doing. So in that sense, I think it worked out great. And truly, I think what helped keep us on board toward our schedule was the fact that Kim actually mapped out dates and really deadlines that we had to hit, and we were all beholden to, and we all bought into, we all drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, from the beginning of this. And to be sure, we respected those, and we got there one way or the other, and helped each other out, and that's part of the thing too, is that, we have each other's backs. So, if I was slipping in some area, in terms of the technicality of radio, et cetera, they were there to shore me up, and for whatever I could help with them, the same. So if the support really has to be reciprocal from the beginning, to keep things going, we were just fortunate to have that kind of arrangement.
Okay, thank you. I'm just aware of including everyone who might want to ask a question. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I will come to you. Otherwise, I'll keep going with the questions that came up during the discussion earlier. So I've got a question here that came up in the discussion. How did you extract and document the evidence extracted from the listening you did?
I think we just took general notes. Because we did know that we were looking for certain themes. So I remember saying, like, we need to dig into the social media. So we had to then go to the social media and start to take notes on what's there and what's not there. And so once one of us could pick up a pattern, they might share, hey, here's what I did. It's like, okay, well, maybe we'll go that route because that's exactly what we're looking for. But I think it was a lot of note sharing and sharing about themes, what themes are resonating with you. What else would you all like to add, David and Kyle?
No, I agree. I think that was one of the main ways that we went through our content was just understanding, not only do we have kind of a blend of different perspectives within this podcasting genre, but then also, when we took notes on one, because like I helped out with, one of the main podcasts in particular, and then saying, okay, this is kind of what we're seeing. We are noticing similar content and like still processing and the nod. Is this the case? Or, is this kind of a little bit different and we need to kind of make note of, how they're differently using social media or how they're, using different types of social media for particular constructs, and so building that from like the first podcast we analyzed all the way through provides some really clear juxtapositions for not just the different types of content within the genre, different publishing, different ownership groups, but then different ways to use popular social media with their audience.
Yeah, so I think to build on that, a lot of the podcasts that we ended up going to, we picked up clues from, yes, what people were talking about on social media, et cetera, or how they were being covered in the mainstream media, to then go back and find those and then drill down deeper and actually do our explication then of that process. But a lot of this has to do with not only the text, but the meta text, the metadata around it, that kind of the buzz that's going on online, as Kyle's saying too, the industrial shifts that are occurring in terms of ownership. Those kinds of things were part and parcel of what we were looking at, as opposed to just a close textual analysis. But we we seem to coalesce on a couple of different areas and seem to. I think we had worked that out early on, right? When we made our outline, we decided, okay, these are the podcasts that we're going to be looking at, and these make the most sense given our theoretical framework and given our methodology and given our overarching research questions, right? So we made sure that those lined up properly. So this was definitely what's called purposive sampling in terms of methodology, and that's to say that our evidence was obviously carefully chosen, right, from the beginning.
Thanks. One of the key points, which actually, Kim, you highlighted in your presentation that I took away from this, was this idea that it's difficult to troll a podcast because you have to have a time commitment to actually listen to the thing, and B, you can't kind of search audio. You can't currently search audio for phrases and things that you want to, troll against. Would you like to expand a bit about that? And also, do you feel that the current changes whereby maybe there is a bit of the big conglomerates coming in and trying to take over podcasting, is that a threat to this kind of lack of gatekeeping, this kind of free speech that is given African Americans, a place to talk without gatekeeping? Kim, you're shaking your head.
Because I'm on the fence. I'll address the trolling part first. Again, it's about that barber shop, beauty salon, church kind of vibe. Not anyone can just walk in there and jump in the conversation. So that's important. Like if a troll gets in, they're going to be dealt with in a very specific way. So the trolling, I think, is, like I said, I think it's a blessing and it's a curse. And David mentioned this as well. We have these enclaves that are, built for, I would imagine, Black listeners. However, it's podcasting. So it's open for anyone to come in and sort of get the lesson that's on the agenda for today. So the trolls not having access is great. It gives Black podcasters, that platform to just, get out there and say what needs to be said without having to have this combativeness that might come from, for example, a troll. Before we go to the second question, I wanted to see if David and Kyle want to build on that.
Yeah. I mean, I can say that that's one of the great powers, that the medium has. The medium of podcasting is it's it's the fact that it's not screen based. As you're saying, Jerry, that you can't break it down, and it's not beholden to a word search on Google or something, right? But these technologies are in the works at the moment. On the one hand, A, and B, PodTrack I think is doing something in this area. And B, very strangely, there a lot of podcasts are now being transcribed. Okay, and that seems to be a total violation of the whole notion of, well, this is an audio medium, and wow, why don't you just write an article then if you're doing that, right? But the thought is that some people are hearing impaired, right? And it does give access to those folks with those disabilities. But the idea is that searchability is definitely going to be in our future, I think, for better or for worse, maybe for worse in some cases. But at the time being, we seem to see podcasting at a moment where it is not regulated. It is one of the least regulated, one of the least censored, and I would argue, therefore, one of the most politically potent media forms in digital publishing today. Certainly the fastest developing, the fastest growing, but I would argue also politically the most powerful. It's very difficult for totalitarian regimes, for example, for authoritarian regimes, for highly censorious media climates, to actually clamp down on podcasting. It's the last thing they can control, right? In those countries, they can definitely block and ban whole sectors of the internet, but to go through and to find where those sort of subversive cells are through audio, very difficult kind of task. So I think, to be sure, we see Black podcasting move into this space early on, and no one bothered Black podcasting. No one pushed back. No one, sort of detonated a bomb in the middle of it. And to be sure, it thrived. And now we've got this efflorescence. We've got this sort of, renaissance, if you will. And the argument that we make, just from the very outset, is that this is one of the moments in media history where we can actually see some of the more rich, intellectually challenging questions about race that we've ever seen in the history of audio media. And it's thanks to the medium then taking over and giving us those, unformatted, wildly large kind of spaces to work through these ideas in. So we have these media products that are clearly operating in the deep end of the pool and not, in this sort of shallow end of, right, very, very superficial representations of Blacks, for example, typically by white producers for white audiences that then draw from things like, minstrel show, 19th century entertainment, et cetera, which would be Amos and Andy of the 20th century. The most popular, sort of Black themed radio show of the entire 20th century, which is, abysmally shameful. Right, that something that openly racist would be the most popular sort of form of media information that people got about Black people. That's I guess the most troubling thing that I get out of that, and that's where we were pivoting and showing, well, where's the progress being made, and then we would go to the non and still processing and the read, with these deeply pop cultural kinds of subjects, doing that kind of work of really correcting for that, horrible backsliding that had occurred before. But yes, I think at some point though, podcasts will be more searchable. Right now they're not, and in some ways that's a nice thing, because those conversations then that come out of them are from people who are really there, who really listen to those podcasts carefully, and that matters too. And yeah, the door is open for folks to come in and listen, as Kim says, but it's not all the way open, and that's pretty important.
Thank you. Yeah, well, actually, having listened to you say that, one of the things that came out that everyone really thought worked really well, part of this paper, was the use of Beyonce and Black Panther of kind of like case studies within the case studies of how they talked about these subjects, and like using pop culture to create these discursive cultural guides, and as well your paper being a kind of highbrow academic paper, using that pop culture reference to tie it all together. So, I mean, would anyone like to expand on how that kind of idea developed?
I'll jump in, but I'm hoping that Kyle and David will assist me on this one. Again, it was a matter of the listening and, coming up with a theme. What we found very interesting is with those themes, Beyonce and Black Panther, the way each of those podcasters covered those topics was uniquely different, which we very much appreciated and kind of just magically fit into everything that we were doing. But if you listen to the read, you will know, like, they talk about Beyonce like almost every episode. So that was a given. Of course, the buildup to Black Panther came years before the production was complete. So again, this is another topic that you would hear threaded into any of these podcasts at almost any time. So it really, I wouldn't say it was a given that we would cover those topics, but they ended up being a good fit for us.
And I think it really gets.
Go ahead, Kyle.
I'll make it really quick. I think it really gets to the heart of our paper too. And when we were talking about, discursive cultural guides and understanding that these are two, very mainstream pop culture figures, but the way it influences Black podcasting and understanding, the cultural lived identities is completely vastly different. And I found the same thing with Kim, is that the, three consistencies throughout these three podcasts, but at the same time, how they're covered, extremely different, and what that means for understanding those lived experiences and cultures within this podcasting genre.
And for what that means for audience, right? And then how it lives on social media, which was one of our big questions from the onset. And because we didn't see an even kind of level of participation, or even a robust level of participation from show to show and from producer to producer, we thought, oh no, we don't have a paper anymore, right? We're done for. Until Kim had a correspondence with a friend who said, well, wait a minute, might that be an actual strength of some shows to not necessarily be reaching out their tentacles into every social media platform out there, but to actually have something like that enclave, like we were talking about, that digital space that is less searchable, that is less sort of hyperactive on social media, as it were. But the other thing, to your point about, a highbrow study like this bringing in pop culture, that is really an excellent point, because I think it's part and parcel to understanding questions about how a culture works, is to look at what people are actually consuming, okay, in that culture. And on a mass scale, and really talking about, as Kim says, on a day-to-day, episode-to-episode, kind of show-to-show basis. That's where the majority of the time is spent. Then we owe it to ourselves as academics to get into there and understand what's going on, and not do, say, what public radio and NPR did, right, which was to really move away from any kind of exploration into ethnic spaces. This is why we end on the whole idea of the whiteness of NPR, right? And that was pushed onto us, really, and we ended up embracing it from one of our reviewers, right, who said, hey, you need to end with a thump. You need to end with authority here to say, we do not see in mainstream radio enough Blackness, okay? And I mean mainstream public, NPR, its traditions, it's changing though, right? And I mean, we can see huge changes just in the last 5 years, just in the last maybe 5 months too, for what public radio is doing this way. And I mean, we can thank the BLM movement, the George Floyd riots, et cetera, for a lot of that. But the thought is that, yeah, the whiteness of NPR is well documented, well documented. And we needed to end on that to show that progress is being made, right, to sort of correct for that. I think there's a hand up too.
Yeah. Beatrice.
Not to interrupt, I was just, if I could ask a question, is that okay?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Kim, David and Carl, for this really fascinating paper and discussion. And congratulations on the prize, that's very exciting. I suppose I just wanted to ask a question about podcasting models and where it's all kind of going. Because Kim, I think you mentioned how is it still processing who were sort of their content production is becoming a bit sporadic, and it kind of made me think about how labor intensive content production is, and a lot of these podcasts are sort of DIY, and also there was this obviously this sort of scandal quote unquote emerging from Gimlet recently, where Eric Eddings was sort of highlighted the fact that Reply All and some of the producers, I think, were quite anti-union and racist as well. So I was wondering whether you could talk a bit about this sort of tension that's emerging between the sort of dominant models of financing podcasts through like Spotify and things like that, and the kind of more kind of critical discourse coming out of podcasting that does critique neoliberalism, and whether I don't know, films like Patreon are going to protect Black podcasters by sort of keeping these enclaves behind a paywall, as it were. I don't know. I just wonder if you could just respond to that question a little bit. Thank you.
I'll try to jump in there in terms of the conglomeration in podcasting and in its effect on Black podcasters, I'll say, especially as we look at the Nod and Eric Eddings and the racial reckoning that's going on in public media and in podcasting, apparently. But I mean, it stems from just a lack of respect for Black laborers. I mean, I don't know if you all saw the follow-up from James T. Green, who worked with the Nod. I can't even put it in words. It's really heartbreaking. I'll share it with you in the chat. But he goes on to talk about that dissension, between the Black and brown bodies and everyone else at Gimlet at that time, and that really plays out in real life. In terms of these separations that, right in house. And he talks about the glass and how you can see, one side has a different lifestyle, who gets an Uber, who takes the train home, those kinds of disparities. I mean, they're still very rampant in media. I won't even narrow it down to just radio, audio, podcasting. It really is out there. How do we change that? It's problematic. We had the Renee, what's Renee's last name? She had the equity and audio pack going on. It really seemed promising. But then just this week, we saw one of the RAIN summit. They had an entire summit with no Black people on the list. It's like, how did that happen? And the sponsors were many people who signed the pact. It's just, who's at the gate, who's watching? And when we're not watching, you see what happens. So we really have to get people who are, serious and who are true allies to try to help us combat the situation. Because on the other hand, the fail up is real. When we look at it, Andy Mills from the New York Times, I mean, guaranteed, Andy's going to have a podcast company in 2 days, right? It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. Same thing with the guys from the guy from Reply All, PJ Voigt. Again, he stepped away from that. He's going to come back. And it's not to say I don't want these people to ever work again. That's not the point. But Black podcasters aren't given the same fail up opportunity. This is part of the problem. I don't have a solution, but we see the cyclicalness of this, and where will the change take place? I don't know if that answers your question or if I went down a different road.
No. Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you, Kim.
Would anyone else care to take that, Kyle or David?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, yeah, conglomeration is pretty clear what's going on. This acceleration toward obviously, fewer shows at the very top and a much higher barrier for entrance, into the industry by shows that are on the periphery and shows that are more independently produced. I mean, would we see a show like The Read today be able to just make it in and gain a foothold in an industry that's dominated by so few shows? It's really pretty troubling what's going on. And Spotify's takeover is not to be underestimated. It is like a force of nature. They've been laying out hundreds of millions of dollars to just straight out acquire Gimlet, okay, itself. And the Joe Rogan Experience, right? There's a huge audience there, and it's obviously a problematic show in terms of content because Joe Rogan had on his show, Alex Jones, right, of InfoWars, and really just sort of pandered to him, very disappointingly in terms of my sense of what was going on. And of course, Spotify did not hold their feet to the fire at all, and just simply said, oh, well, we have a lot of creators, there's nothing we can do about this. Well, but that's the spread of racism on the one hand, misinformation on the other, conspiracy theories, and what Alex Jones is a purveyor of. And so that, unfortunately, conglomeration is opening the door for a lot of extremist far right kind of content, closing the door for more progressive voices, like LGBTQ shows, Latinx shows, and Black podcasts. There is something troubling there. Now, if you don't want to say, well, there's sort of this evil villain behind Spotify, right, pulling the strings. But I will say, if you look at their biggest acquisitions, right, it's to be Joe Rogan Experience at the top of the list, but they also bought The Ringer, okay, which is Bill Simmons's really, I want to call it a podcast first digital website, right, digital publication. It's sports journalism. He's a former ESPN commentator, wildly popular, to the tune of several hundreds of millions of dollars also. So what has happened there is that we can just sort of see the common denominator. Do we see any Black podcasters in these acquisitions? No, we don't, right? And so what's happening is then a de-diversification, so to speak, of the long tail of the industry, which we saw in the early going now with this sort of move toward conglomeration. And it's becoming more homogenous. It's becoming more, let's just face it, hegemonic. Is there anything wrong politically with Bill Simmons? No, but right, as far as I can see, he's not an Alex Jones or something. Obviously he's not doing this. And in some ways, he's incredibly progressive, but still, we don't see a Black podcaster there under the major acquisition list from Spotify, right? And so, as Kim's saying, we've got to look down the list and say, who gets to decide these things? And now look at how it's tilting the playing field in the industry radically.
Kim just mentioned it in the chat, and I was going to mention that exact same thing too, is look at the mirrors between what's happening now and what happened, at least in the US, with the Telecom Act of 96, and how, the free marketplace of ideas turned into conglomeration. And you had Cumulus and Clear Channel buying up thousands of stations, creating kind of more of a streamlined, cookie cutter type of experience, as opposed to diverse perspectives, diverse voices in markets across the US. And so I think that's something that future research projects or future analysis looking at, okay, we had these problems in the broadcast radio industry 25 years ago. Are these starting to manifest themselves now in podcasting, a method that was promoted as a grassroots, free form, unfiltered type of production?
Yeah, and I think right now what you're seeing too is, literally with the death of Rush Limbaugh, new attention has turned toward far right-wing podcasts, right? Because they really all have him to thank for their existence, and even for the whole convention of that genre, which grows out of conservative talk radio. Conservative talk radio is absolutely now an old medium, right? That was going to become a dinosaur, and it has just moved in for some fresh blood for a foothold into this new industry to keep itself alive. And now we see shows like Ben Shapiro, right, who is crushing it in terms of the podcast, rankings. My goodness, he's at the top all the time. We have Dan Bongino, the former Secret Service agent, who is spreading conspiracy theories about the insurrection, blaming it on liberal media of all things. I mean, unbelievable. But his audience is tremendous, not to be underestimated. He occupied something like 8 out of the top 10 spots for Facebook interaction. Dan Bongino did right after the election. So, this is not, to be taken lightly. This is where the far right are getting their ideas. This is where the headlines are being generated for the far right. It's some troubling kinds of things. We were looking at kind of where the medium is doing it right, where the medium is going in ways that are progressive, that are giving voice, that are correcting a history of racist media that goes back to the mid 20th century, that's even traceable into the whiteness of NPR. But the other side of the coin is conglomeration, and I would argue that opens the door for far right-wing media to come in, and that would be with the dropping, Kyle, if we want to get historical, of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987-88, which is precisely when Rush Limbaugh opened his show, right? Because he could say anything; he was unleashed. He didn't have to show any balance. And then you get the rise of the shock jock, right? And the Howard Sterns come out from under their rocks, so to speak, and you see these sort of creatures start to take over that part of the media landscape.
Thank you. We have a couple of raised hands. I'm aware of the time, so we'll have to keep it a little bit short. But Joe, you raised your hand?
Yes, thank you. This is something also that B has mentioned in the chat there. Is I just wonder, though, because podcasting is digital and we have these digital enclaves, that maybe they can continue and they can resist the conglomeration. The nature of the podcasting beast surely can continue to be free and independent. Can they not? Can these communities still survive outside of what we're seeing, the sort of monetized commodification of a world that is white? Can they? I mean, they'll need to commodify, presumably, because they need to make money out of it. But can they survive outside of the big corps?
I'm just going to make it really quick. That article that I just shared with you all from James T. Green, he really does sum it up. It's just like, they're there and they're working for Gimlet, knowing that this Spotify acquisition is in the works, and that divide is there. I mean, he was just like, he says, I got a piece of that. Like, he didn't get fat like some other people. And that's the problem. It's just like, some people are getting fat off of this. David mentioned it. These acquisitions don't include Black and brown people. And so why do we have to, accept less when other people are over here getting more? When are we going to get the recognition? I think it's going to happen. I see, folks like Misha Yusuf, who was able to fight successfully for her IP from, was it KCRW? That kind of enables, and empowers people that, we can have a piece of this pie. And then she ends up, getting to produce the Michelle Obama podcast. So, we're getting in there, but it's just not enough and not at the same scale as what we're seeing everywhere else.
Okay, well, I'll move on then. Rebecca, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I guess I'm kind of interested in the flip side of this, and where the audience fits in, who's getting included and who's getting excluded. So I wondered if you had some thoughts on how you might pursue audience research about who is being addressed in these podcasts, and also who's getting excluded, because we're framing podcasting as this free, emancipatory, highly politically charged opportunity for an inclusive conversation. But it's not really free when you start looking at the cost of the devices to listen, access to internet, and then you look at Patreon, for example, as a solution for a funding model in certain parts of the world anyways. And it's another barrier to access. So how do we crack the accessibility issue?
I mean, some people are doing it, Rebecca. I'm telling you, Clubhouse, your Twitter Spaces, this new one from Mark Cuban, Fireside. I mean, I don't think it's a competition for podcasting, but the monetization component, I think, is very viable. I see it as an extension that you can have your podcast episode roll out on a Thursday and say, join us tomorrow, and have admission to this room to continue the discussion, for example. An extension of the live show, since we can't do live shows, because this is what the Nod and the Read have been doing. When we looked at the Read's Instagram, they're mostly just selling merch and tickets to their live shows. So, that's their opportunity to monetize. Think about this, very similar to musicians. When I think about early rap, like, they didn't make any money from those record deals. They were out on the road on tour hustling to get that money because that money had less of a cut. And so when I saw the proliferation of podcasters doing live shows, I'm just like, what's the attraction to that? It's like, that's uncut money and easy money for them. So it is a certain revenue stream, but I think we just got to get creative. And if you're really doing something organic, you just got to say, hey, what are my opportunities where I live? Like I said, if you're in Africa, you have different opportunities than you do in the US. But I'm curious to know what Kyle and David think about this.
Yeah, and I think immersing yourself in the community and understanding, what perspectives, what organizations, what stories aren't being told, and I think about it from a university perspective because, we all work at universities. What are some diverse student organizations? What are some organizations, promoting events or discussions, that maybe aren't getting picked up from a lot of the mainstream media that you can maybe bring in for a podcast interview or, a college radio show or a college newspaper article, and really kind of broadening the reach that way. And I think that'd be a good place to start, is starting about, okay, what isn't being told, what isn't being discussed, who's reaching out to us to try to get some exposure and try to get some of that discussion. And can we kind of reciprocate that in like a local community podcast or a local community feature?
Yeah, I mean, and I think to their points, which are very well articulated, that, really what we're seeing now is that the long tail is not disappearing. So in other words, those smaller shows, they are actually plenty diverse too. Are they getting the big ticket deals from Spotify? No, but obviously we didn't see LGBTQ shows, okay, in the numbers that we're seeing 5 years ago, okay, even 4 years ago. I mean, there is still a radical diversification of voices out there on the market, despite this movement toward conglomeration. Now, can both be happening at once? Is there enough market share for everyone? Well, no, that's where we have to turn to this sort of model that somebody like Robert McChesney would give us, and to say, yeah, media takeover, media ownership is going to move into any kind of new medium in its infancy as it's growing, and these old kind of forms are going to come in and try to get their foothold on it. But the point being is that I think we do see nonetheless other rays of hope in here, other opportunities, other avenues. I don't think right now that it's a controllable medium, okay, by Spotify or by anyone for that matter. It's too big. You cannot stop these voices from coming out. And the bar is still, thank you very much, pretty low for entry as well. Okay, you still have the capacity to open a mic and start your podcast up. Now, in terms of monetization, Kim raises a good point. Creativity is the key, right? But the sky is the limit. And one doesn't have to constantly bang one's head on the wall going, oh, that's the only way I can monetize is through advertising, or for, whatever mode, through, merchandising, through social media has already been tried and true. Now we're getting lots of innovative ways of making money through podcasting, such as content marketing. And I know a lot of people go, oh no, that's the scourge of journalism. That's where truth speaking and journalism just becomes an advertisement, right? But actually, if you have an audience that's knowing that it's in the space of sponsored content, that's actually okay if it's consensual, so to speak. And if it's really very well produced and well researched, that can also be very good journalism. Inside Trader Joe's, the grocery store chain, right, is a great example. That's an ad. There are much more garish and tawdry examples out there. Coca-Cola, et cetera, I think does some. McDonald's had one. But to be sure, we need to look at that kind of approach and say, well, we don't have to make enemies with it, right? Just because there's an exponent of it that does it wrong. We can do it in a way that's ethical, in a way that's maybe socially progressive too. And to be sure, I see marginalized voices coming into the medium now faster than ever, and in spite of this gross conglomeration that's on the horizon. So can both be true. I think we have to be sort of capable of tolerating that ambiguity here, because it's real. It's too complicated to think all one way about. So.
Thank you, everyone. We've gone a bit over time, but one of the things that any good paper usually leads to when we have the discussions is, I wonder what they're going to do. Are they going to do any further work in this area, or are they going to do any further work in that area? So I'm going to finish with a question just to ask you all. You've already mentioned a little bit that you're working together again. What's the future plans, or what's the future research coming from this paper, or for other reasons?
I can start since I'm lead author on our next project, which is about news podcasting and looking at coronavirus as well as coverage of the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter events over the summer. And kind of on a similar perspective in terms of how is it being covered, what are some of the thematic types of content, discussions that emerged from a statewide public radio network that was at the epicenter of the George Floyd incident, as well as looking at the coronavirus from, kind of a national New York, WNYC national type of, it's not NPR-ish, but it's kind of a national, public radio station. And so looking at, kind of the same things that we looked at in this paper in terms of, what is the content, what are the discussions, what are the interviews, what are similarities between two different components of public radio, and how they covered immense national discussions and topics that occurred within a relatively short range of time, as well as overlapping in that.
Yeah, and Kyle didn't mention that paper won first place in a recent BEA paper competition. So we'll be gathering again soon to have a discussion on that. And I'm going to continue the thread of the Black podcasters. I'm working on a paper about Black female podcasters and the digital erasure of their existence in this field.
I see you've unmuted and muted your mic again, David. So I'll move on.
Well, okay, then I'll just go ahead. And I've been toying with an idea and sort of percolating thoughts toward a book on podcast journalism, and it extends and grows out of a lot of the things that we've talked about so far. So that's kind of where I'm going with this stuff.
Well,
When we talk about community, a couple of things I'm working on in the very early stages are just about how COVID's impacted local media. You know, I'm in a very rural market here in South Dakota, and so looking at how has COVID impacted their production, their funding, and then eventually a community radio study about, you know, kind of marginalized voices, marginalized populations, and how they've thrived in a local radio setting. And so those are kind of future down the road, but projects I think stemming from this one about discussions of content and genre.
Thank you,
Yeah, there are a
Carl.
couple of people in the room who do community radio, so I know their ears perked up when they heard that.
That's me, one of them.
And Joe.
And Joe, yeah. Just to say thanks, Kim, David, Kyle, for your time and for answering the questions and for a fascinating discussion. And thanks to everyone else who came. And this discussion will be on YouTube when it's edited, so within a week or so. And thanks very much.
Thank you.